split. They just maybe they watched the playoff results of the last one to find out who would go to MSI. They know who won Worlds, etc. Right? The initial thing we've got to talk about is I wanted to ask about the state of the league, because I don't think the LPL has ever been as competitive as this year. Like this year, it feels no joke. Like it's not like, and normally in like LCKs like this, for example, it's always stratified by like, there's a top two and then there's two teams below them and then maybe there's three teams below them. And it's like you kind of know exactly where people are at. This split and this year, essentially, feels like there are no the rules as to who the best teams are anymore.
Yeah, this year has been really crazy, and I think we can talk about three main trends that have been happening in the LPL for 2021. The first one is just consolidation. A lot of the bottom teams, they're going to lottery mode, they're going into LDL talent, and they're selling all of their assets off to the teams higher up into the standings. Top Esports, for one, is the one that's always breaking the records year after year and just going out and purchasing the best talent there is, and either Zuo or coming in Qingtian this time around. And the second trend, which I think is also very prevalent but somewhat negative, is the fact that a lot of our old IG members are now just completely falling off the wagon. We've seen this at the start of 2019, but if you look at JackieLove, you look at Rookie, you look at TheShy, they're honestly just not the same players that they were before. So even those teams in the top, I think they're sort of falling off a little bit. And then you have the third big trend, which is the LDL superstars actually coming in. I think most of you, even in the West, have heard of a 17-year-old named Cream, which basically brought OMG all the way from kind of a dumpster truck into a playoff team. So we have three trends kind of going together, and it really makes the split incredibly exciting.
Okay, let's hit the IG one then, because as we alluded to, like the idea that essentially you could have that many teams make the playoffs, but IG doesn't, right? The good news of it is, like I said, it is incredibly actually competitive league. Like there's a lot of teams that have small names that have made it in who are legit if you go and watch them. The bad news is though, as you kind of alluded to there, on paper, when you look at names, and listen, TheShy hasn't played the whole split, but still it's TheShy. You had like that one game where he came back, he looked amazing. Obviously, Rookie, you look at the name Rookie, like this last couple of years is when people finally sort of started giving him his real credit and thinking maybe he should even be allowed to be, shadow boxed against Faker as the best player ever. Like, it's kind of depressing the idea they're not even in the mix, at least. Like, you at least want like the outside chance, right, that they do a miracle run. Why do you think, I mean, you kind of said it there, individually they just haven't actually been good. It's not even just like stylistic problems, right? The whole team's kind of a problem team at the moment.
Yeah, I think we've been seeing this come for a long time, and I've been saying this for a while that IG has been cursed ever since 2019 after losing to Team Liquid at MSI. They have never actually won a playoff series after that. They've always came in around the first round and just got eliminated 0-3 to LNG when they first started, and it looked progressively worse down the end. So I think it was a long time coming, but the main thing coming into this split that got a lot of people hyped was that, hey, maybe with a new coach, they could turn things around. And the answer was it didn't make a difference whatsoever. Like, their laning phase was actually still somewhat okay, but the problem with this team is that as I think the coordination got a lot better on the rest of the squads, they still decided to play aggressive all the time. Like, the number one issue for them was that they did not try to play safe cross map. So when you saw their own team taking Drake, TheShy was still going ham 100% on the top side. He didn't care if the rest of his teammates were showing on the map, and that was a very persistent issue. It just seemed like they had an okay first 10 minutes of the game, and then when it gets to 12 mid-game, a lot of commentators just said that it seemed like they were a team that simply did not speak to each other, and they would just each individually go ham in their lane and just all die off. It was incredibly depressing to see, but also something that was honestly just a long time in the making.
One thing that I found quite shocking was actually the decline of Rookie individually, because even though there have been past years where like his team wasn't good enough, certainly there were years where they didn't qualify to Worlds, he was often still one of the best players. Like last year, for example, if people don't know, he was really good in the summer and amazing actually, even in the gauntlet. Like, it's just his team wasn't good enough. But the problem, so in the past for me, the only times he's really been bad is maybe that one split where he had to take a few games off, etc. He had like his own issues outside the game. But the idea he would actually become like not a relevant mid laner in the LPL, that is quite shocking actually. Like, what would you say? What was this year like for Rookie, do you think?
Well, I think the main issue was, number one, I think motivation. It was very hard for him to keep the same level of just fire under him. I think in the previous years, if you looked at the post-game interviews coming into the playoffs, he was at least somewhat hopeful. He said that they should win. And right now he's just completely deflated. He's like, we should try and do better. So I feel like mentality is part of it. And the other one really is the meta. Like, we are playing in a meta that is saturated with power picks. You have a lot of things in the mid lane that just snowball incredibly hard. LeBlanc, Akali, and also things like Viego. If they get ahead, they're almost always staying ahead. So if you lose up in the mid game, there really isn't much you can do to come back. I don't think it's a meta anywhere where you have champions that scale later into the game, coming in from the mid lane. Like, you used to have things like Echo maybe and Rise that could sort of come back, but with the decline of mages in general, I don't think that's really possible in the meta anymore. So once you go down, you just kind of stay down, and I think those are the two big factors that you see from Rookie just not having the same spark anymore.
What did you think on that? I know a lot of people often comment that based on interviews they've done, like TheShy is sort of implied, like when Rookie retires, I'll retire, or, you know, like we're sort of a package deal or something. And if you ever notice in interviews, I want to get your sense of this, because obviously I could be viewing it through some fucked up prism of, like, I do find certain things funny that other people don't. Like, for example, whenever TheShy does interviews, Clement, I always get the vibe, no joke, that when he's talking, because I always tell people he's got the most bizarre perspective on his own career. Like, he seems to me like he was watching a different career than I've been watching, because, for example, he always describes himself, no joke, as like a guy who, you know, likes to play tanks and stuff, and like basically the opposite to what his playing style actually is, you know, like as though him and Rookie are the ones that were, like, you know, conservative in the game, and it's just like the idiot JackieLove and Ning that are fucking hinting. Meanwhile, you watch the game as an observer, you're like, dude, it's you, what? You're the one who's doing that. And if I was Rookie, by the way, I would be like, where's the we here? Like, I'm more like that. Like, you know, I try to keep the game under control. Like, you're out of control. So I've always felt like TheShy does try to make it seem like, you know, him and Rookie are like the number one and number two in the team. Do you actually get the sense, if Rookie retires at the end of the year, do you think TheShy goes as well? Does he just leave completely?
I'll be honest, it's really hard to see how TheShy, like, I'm not even sure how passionate he is about, like, winning all the way, to be absolutely honest with you. Like, there are a lot of mistakes from TheShy that are just, you just watch them as like, well, why is this guy doing this? Like, he's constantly overextending, he dies a lot in lane, and there are games where he seems okay, but those are purely in early laning phase. Like, you don't have a game where he's like carrying from start to finish. So it's really hard for me to say like what he actually wants to do. And like, if you look at things from his perspective, he got a lot of success very, very early on in his career. Sure. He's already a world champion. I'm sure he doesn't really need to worry about money for the rest of his life. So in that sort of a situation, like, I you know, there's a phrase in Mandarin that says that poverty limits your imagination, and unfortunately, I'm the guy that's
all right. I see. Okay,
so I can't really.
That's a good line.
Like, it's hard.
It's a good line. True. No, by the way, I would even agree. That's actually a very shrewd way to phrase it. Because the other thing about TheShy, I feel like a lot of Westerners don't get, is this guy has always in interviews been very strange. Like, he's never basically implied in interviews that he loves being a pro player and that, like, you know, winning the championship is his ultimate goal, etc. Like, he actually does come off strange in interviews, right? He almost comes off like a bit of, basically the joke is he comes off like you'd want him to, like a weird anime sort of fucking villain. Like, he looks like he, you know, you never really know what his motivations are. Like, sometimes he seems like he doesn't care about losing the game, even if he plays the way he wants to, you know.
Yeah, like he's been caught on camera just straight up laughing at times when games go horribly wrong. Okay. So it's like, it's kind of hard for me to infer that, but I really hope that IG actually do start making changes and coming up higher on the roster. Like, I'm not sure what the state of the team is. If you've been watching Weibo, like, IG has actually been making huge waves on Weibo just with the Ning drama and with the owner coming in and backing up his players and, you know, talking smack about some casters as well. So it's a bit of a madhouse there, and I'm not really sure what their priority is. And until they actually show like a very strong focus, it's kind of hard to trust an IG to take themselves back into the postseason. I feel like this is a team that just you need to see some big changes straight from the top in order for this team to start improving from the player level.
As I alluded to earlier on, like, normally I would just skip all the teams that don't make the playoffs. So we would, in fact, we might even skip some of the playoff teams normally. But there's one team we have to briefly touch on before we get into the playoff squads. And it is the aforementioned Jingdong, the team that last year was not only the champion, semi-finalists, a quarter-finalist at Worlds, were in the other final LPLs. They were one of the best teams in the world last year. This year, even this split, they were actually still in totally fine position until basically the last, like, 7 weeks of the tournament or something. And basically, the end of this split, they have just lost all the games, all of them. So, like, dude, this is crazy to me, Clement, because I have to say, when you look at, as a Westerner, when you look at the Jingdong lineup, I always thought what a great job the general manager of this team must have done, because it's such a well-constructed team. Like, the pieces all fit together for playing style. They've got some really, really big strengths, obviously, like Zoom, Kanavi. Like, how does a team like this not make playoffs, mate?
So if we go back to our previous conversation about Jingdong Gaming and how unique they were a team that actually did not have a dominant laning phase. They were the only LPL championship to win without an extrapolation from the gold graph into the later phases of the game. What they used to do was they would come back in team fights, and they really knew how to juggle around objectives. And then create those situations where they could turn on Barons or turn from Drakes to catch the enemy team off guard and snowball that way. They're very unique because there really aren't many teams that do that, and there aren't any teams in the past in history that could play a teamfight focused game without a star 80 carry. I think this is just reality coming in and knocking on the door of JD Gaming, to be absolutely honest. I felt like they've punched above their weight for a very long time. And what we've seen from this split is when snowballing has become so much more powerful, when you have a very power pick saturated meta, is that it's not really viable to not contest in the laning phase and then somehow seek to come back into the objective fights. That was the main issue we saw them go for. I actually felt like there were a couple of ways that they could have gone. They could have toned down the reliance on Kanavi hard carrying them into the late game team fight and switch in more over to an early game centric ganking jungler that just focused on the top side. I thought that was the most obvious answer, but unfortunately they didn't really go for that. What we saw them going for in the later half of the weeks is that they would go for very strong lanes, but a scaling jungler into the late game and try to have that scaling jungler carry them through, much like they did in their winning split in 2020 spring split. So they actually went back to something old, but it didn't really work out. I felt like their lanes fell far behind, and this split especially, I felt like XiaoHu was very heavily outmatched. Like going up against Cream, going up against Scout, and then you have Doinby coming in. It was very difficult for him to actually find an angle to get advantages. And also, if you think about the meta this time around, Aluma still had a rather quiet split. It wasn't that great of a split for hard engaged supports. We actually had a lot of Enchantress coming around. Really, the only one that stayed around the meta that was very relevant was Nautilus, and that wasn't enough for the roam-centric sort of strategy to come out for JD Gaming. So I think in general, JD Gaming is just a return to means for them. Like, I felt like they were actually punching above their weight for far too long.
Right.
And finally, the archetypical pressures finally brought them down a little bit.
Sure. Because, by the way, I'll just say there's another one of those like tragedies for international fans, because you can always tell the international fans that only watch like Worlds and don't watch the LPL because they always come with the wackest opinions. Like, for example, they all think basically the two players that were the victims of last year, Knight and Zoom, because everyone who watches LPL, we all told them like they're the best players in the world, and then they went to Worlds and it was like they were all right, you know, but they obviously didn't set the tournament on fire. So, like, if people don't know, like, Zoom is still a very good player, right?
Yeah, I mean, Zoom's still pretty good, but I feel like in general, it's quite difficult for him to have an impact right here. He doesn't really have that much jungle support, and the team for the previous few splits have actually decided to play away from him. They don't really hard force his lane to get leads. They're a very different team when you compare them to someone like RNG, which they clearly try to hard force advantages onto the top side, onto XiaoHu. They take a different track where they actually have Kanavi hard farming and trying to still play the 6v4 strategy. So you see them, they prioritize a lot of Viegos for draft onto Kanavi and try to get him an advantage over the opposing jungler and then take that to win team fights. But that really hasn't worked out so much, and I feel like either they need to have a shift in jungler or they need to find a different laner in either the bottom side or in the mid lane to give them consistent leads in lanes. Like, you can't really think about an LPL team that doesn't have a consistent lane leader that goes into the postseason.
Right, so if people don't know, because to be fair, almost every year they do tweak the LPL format. The format is actually the exact same, obviously, as Spring, if you saw that. So it's a bit weird because it's the most unique format in the world, actually, which is it starts out as a single elim bracket, but it sort of has like an element like the Korean gauntlet, where you place in the league jumps you forwards in the single elim part. And then this is where it's complicated. If you make it to like the top 4 part, basically then it becomes double elim, which is why last year's split, if people remember, FPX was actually in like prime position once we get to the double elim part, but then bizarrely RNG did all these like miracle game 5 wins in like series after series after series and then just clutched out the whole playoffs. So basically what it means is we can actually like start out with just the lesser teams because they're the ones who play round 1. So the round 1 matchups is LNG versus Suning and then WE versus OMG. So if we start with the LNG one, right, Clement, so Suning, people again, if they only know Worlds, are going to be like, wow, Suning, the team that was second place. It's like, first of all, that was an overperformance anyway. And then secondly, you have to remember, one, they don't have Sword Art anymore. They somehow tricked Reginald into thinking he was actually amazing and sold him for $6 million. That's like some Bernie Madoff level corruption, but whatever. Whoever pulled that out should be like executive of the year or something. Like, that's one of the craziest deals. That should be like that Donald Trump thing, like, this was the worst deal ever, you know, like that fucking meme. But anyway, they got rid of him, right? But which, to be fair, he was pretty old in his career. Like, he was probably not going to be I heard he might even have like retired in the LPL anyway, or been like a benched player. And then the other angle to mention was they actually haven't been that relevant this split. Like, they've sort of just been a whatever team, and then they just like kind of crept into the playoffs like as the split ended. So where's Suning at the moment? Like, as I've alluded to, they're not a contender, right?
Yeah, if you look at the playoffs in general, honestly, like we can skip ahead. I only have 3 teams that's like real contenders to win the whole thing, and that's going to be FPX, RNG, and Edward Gaming.
Perfect.
I feel like those 3s are, much further above the rest of the heap, and you will notice that Top Esports is missing there. So we will get into that later.
Yeah.
But starting from the first round here, I think Suning. The big question that we had the last time we talked about was going to be able to provide tempo and be this big engaged support, and the answer is a decidedly no. Suning is actually still the slowest team in the entire LPL, not only in actual game time, but also in tempo. So they have a very clear identity what they want to do, and that's actually centered around 3 item carries. I don't think any other team actually centers their play around just getting into the 30-plus minute mark, but Suning, that's where you go. They typically like to play around Bin and Huanfeng to get them big leads, and they're still great in terms of late-game team fights, and they have a couple of champions that are very unique compared to the rest of the league, and those are Camille and Jinx. They're pretty much the only team that relies on these 2 champions, and the way they play is, for the early game, they have Angel, who just tries to put out all the fires across the map. They try to get him counter picks that can leave lane. He's kind of like a Doinby that doesn't snowball. He's played 19 champions this split and has a very heavy reliance on globals. So he will show up in lane just to make sure that these carries don't get ganked early on and can continue to scale up. Now, that being said, this is not a very sound strategy in this day and age. Most of the teams rely on 2 item carries at most, and they just go all in. If they run into teams that actually trade sides very aggressively, like FPX and RNG, I think they just completely collapse. So Suning, they have the raw talent and potential to go a lot higher in the standings, but I don't think they really stand a chance against the competitors that we've talked about, like the 3 big at the top of the league.
Sure. And then obviously the team they play, LNG, which to most people, if you're not a follower of LPL, is going to be a brand new team because they were like a team in the LPL. They just weren't relevant in the past. But the key storyline is they have Tarzan, the formerly Great Griffin jungler, who actually was looking pretty good earlier in the split. And then the other player they have is, if you followed LPL at all, you'll know from his OMG days, obviously Icon was like used to be at least like something of a highlight player back in the day. Right, this is the team at Clement that started super brilliant in the split. They were actually like top of the standings, but understandably, they weren't going to stay there forever. Like, the team is not actually that good. It's all right, but it's not that good, is it?
They started out 7-0, and I did think part of their success was just catching a lot of these top teams off guard. They managed to run into RNG early on, and then they were reduced to a record that I think came much down to earth, and 3 wins and 5 losses after that stretch. And I think the main issue for them is that, well, let's start with the pros. I think they were the first team to really realize how powerful the power picks were in the meta. and they were willing to just all in onto them and give Tarzan carry potential over them. I think they were the first team to really unlock the Diana craze across the LPL. They paired that up with the Yasuo multiple times to get the leads going, and later into the split, I think some of the cracks started to show. Number one was actually their bot lane. Light has been a hyper carry, 80 carry throughout the entirety of his career, but as we all know, 80 carry really doesn't matter this split. The bot lane is much more about just folding into the top side of the map. It's much more about herald fights. So when their gimmicks were sort of found out and teams were able to avoid getting snowballed on by Tarzan and Icon, I felt like they lacked a lot of teamfight potential later into the game, and they lacked a lot of damage. That's very evident in terms of their DPM charts. They just didn't have the firepower to hang on with the rest of the squads, and that was kind of the main reason they started to scale back into the wins. Is just like, I feel like they had a one-punch strategy, but after that, their teamfight identity still was not very clear, and they didn't really have split pushing either. We have a couple of teams that did go into the 1-3-1. Suning is actually one of them that was somewhat successful with that strategy, especially with the tier 2 towers giving extra gold. But LNG, they didn't really have much, and it kind of felt like spring at the end of summer.
So as you said, like if we talk about the other two matchup, so WE versus OMG, right? The brief version of that is like WE actually has some names people might actually enjoy watching. Like obviously everyone always raves about Beishang. I would say you have to put in Maul, who used to be in V5, was obviously almost like a meme player, but he actually is pretty decent. Breathe obviously has been something of a revelation. And then on the OMG side, this is the team where, as you said, it's just player cream that's kind of like a big deal right now.
Yeah, this is interesting on the matchup. I'll wrap up with like Suning and LNG. I still expect Suning to come out at the other matchup. This one's rather interesting because I think in the regular split, we actually saw a 9,000 gold comeback coming in from OMG. And that really sparked a lot of hope that maybe OMG is going to get a sort of a surprise win here, an underdog win. And you know, we should start with them. The first big name you have to know is Cream, coming into the mid lane, very young, an assassin player. I think he's the most precise player that I have ever seen with positioning and getting himself into the angle where he can get multiple knockups. We've seen this with his LeBlanc, with his Qiyana, which is a really weird pick that nobody else really plays, and also with his Yasuo. He's consistently able to just get a bunch of people with his ultimates and then snowball for the fight from there, so it's never really over for OMG. Overall, the team does play sort of a death ball strategy. I don't think they're particularly sophisticated, but if they find a lead and if they have damage items on Cream, they can come back from ridiculous deficits, as we have seen on the WE side. So still a bit of a one-trick pony, but one that's very hard to deny because it is based on individual talent coming in from OMG's side.
Most people are going to heavily favor WE though, right, in the matchup?
Yes, I still do favor WE quite a lot. I think overall WE still has a much better top side, and that has been kind of what's dragging OMG behind, is that outside of their mid lane, their side lanes don't actually have the greatest of laning advantages. They are still usually behind in the matchup. To be fair, I think New has improved a lot. He's got solo kills over Nuguri and stuff like that, but still this is not a top laner that is in your upper echelon of the league. So outside of the mid lane, the solo lanes still tend to fall behind. They have great support players in Aki and Cold that can roam pretty well and create those picks, but in general, they're still looking for their mid laner to get snowballed, or it's kind of bust.
Right, so based on some of that, for the WE versus OMG series, like realistically, WE should win the series. I know they're heavily favoured here, so I actually feel like, just for some fun, I do actually think there's some good players on OMG. I don't think realistically they should win the series, but these odds are pretty nuts in my opinion. So what I'm going to do is I'm just going to put a little cheeky low-key bet on OMG to actually take this one, just as an outside chance. I don't think either team's that good. Neither team's going to Worlds in my opinion, but I do think OMG, there's an outside shot they do it, and I just think the odds are pretty cool.
Okay.
And then if we move up, then now we start to get to the teams that obviously are like, these are maybe the dark horses. So one of them is Bilibili Gaming, where if people don't know, this is a team where, again, this is how you actually know the GMs in the league that are doing good work. A couple of years ago, this team was just the team that was based around Meteor and fucking Kuro. It was a totally different squad. The way they've re-upped this team is so interesting, because this is the team where, if people don't know, they have the top laner Bowie, who's basically just been solo killing everyone in the fucking league since he came in, and has been a fucking monster. And And then obviously you have the bot lane actually is pretty interesting because they have PP God, who also was the V5 player who got all the hype. And then they have Aiming, who's a Korean AD carry, who, if people don't know, was actually like, he clearly had talent when he was back in Korea. Actually looked like he should be in LPL fucking AD carry, quite frankly. So this squad, like, they've done a pretty good job making this team, it looks like.
Yeah, this is one of the most fun teams that I had witnessed just watching them rebuild, because I feel like the direction they took was not very obvious. So what they actually did was, instead of increasing their ceiling by focusing aiming, and just trying to build around him into like a team fighting team, what they actually did was that they said Biubiu was actually the constant of this team. And
Yes.
like you said, Biubiu gets a lot of solo kills, but he also gives a lot of deaths. This guy
Sure.
is, he's kind of, we used to call him Budget TheShy, basically. So, that's what they did. And it's really interesting what they decided to change is that, the biggest improvements is they actually got a lot of, early game potential and snowballing coming in from PP God that could then roam from the bottom lane, and very contrary to what they did in previous splits, where they actually just tried to hard focus on aiming. They were not a good teamfight team. They just got aiming on Samira and Kalista and tried to snowball the entire game. They actually went for a completely different strategy, where instead they actually put aiming on things like Ezreal and Varus, where he could stay in lane by himself and then carry them in the late game. So they played completely away from aiming and completely into Biubiu, which in my mind is actually kind of madness, because if you're just looking in a vacuum, aiming is clearly the better player. But
sure,
because of the meta here, and because of a lot of times this is it's very contradictory to conventional wisdom, but a lot of times the path to success is actually bringing up your floor. It's not heightening your ceiling.
Yes,
it's making sure
sense.
you have you have less fail-safe situations. So they gave Biubiu a much better split. They folded into the top lane. They had much better Herald control. And I feel like this split, with the addition of PP God, they actually had significantly better team fighting as well. So it's a very different track. It's interesting to see these teams improve in the standings like this. But yeah, that's kind of what they did. And I think a huge benefactor was also Zika. Because a lot of support attention was now leaving the lane and heading into mid, and the meta was much more assassin focused, we saw Zika end the split with a 44 KDA on Akali. So he was a huge benefactor, and generally BLG is now more of a topside team, and then they switched to aiming post 30 minutes to carry them through the team fighting.
On that point there, actually, let me ask a follow-up, because the interesting thing about what you said is, first of all, like, I actually agree with the general premise. Like, the way you improve, basically, if you're already good, is you get rid of your weaknesses. I know it sounds counterintuitive because you think you should work on your strength, but no, obviously, the more tiny amount of fraction of your weakness you take away, your strength just shines through even more. But then the part I would say it's interesting is what you said about how they kind of set the team up around Bui, because that actually is that's quite different to how, how people say the meta should be played in the West. Because in the West, the perception with a lot of really good top laners is it's harder to play through top lane than it is through bot lane. Like, there's more ganks can happen in the bot lane, blah, blah, blah. So their perception is, if you have like equally good players, you'd usually just have the top laner sort of like play the occasional carry, and half the time he'd be a weak side player. But the reason that this is interesting to me is because in the LPL, you would also say historically that was the vibe. Like, if people don't know, during all the splits when TheShy was the one with the solo kill record, that really was insane, because he used to get those solo kills with almost no fucking like top lane attention. He was just doing it because he's just TheShy, isn't he? Like, it was a league that was about, if you had the star AD carry, of course you play through bot lane. So is this actually like counter to the whole league in general? Has the league's philosophy changed? What would you say?
I said they're different teams. The main thing about the meta, and I just want to illustrate what links these concepts together, is actually just the roaming potential from jungle and support. A lot of bot lanes are not that heavy on 2v2 because there are a lot of picks that don't necessarily need 2v2 attention to scale up. You're thinking like Ziggs, right. You're thinking like Ezreal and Varus in the meta. These are not champions that you can snowball very easily against, and they have a lot of wave clear. So I think the core theme is how you can move your jungle and your support together to achieve maximum efficiency. And sometimes that's going to be through mid. Sometimes that's just going to be through like a 4v2 into the bot side, which is how FPX plays. And sometimes it's going to be about sacking the entire bot side and moving everyone top, which is the way that RNG plays. So I feel like there are a number of teams. I think both are actually somewhat viable strategies. And even at the top of the league, you have teams that clearly favor one strategy over the other. But the general connecting theme behind all of this is that just because of the power picks in terms of the meta, where you have a lot of snowbally picks in mid and jungle, it's mainly about like how you can move your jungle and support pieces around that to further your advantages. So it's I think it's a bit of both, honestly. But to continue on the BLG's point, the really funny thing that BLG has recently done, and I think it's going to play a huge part in the playoffs, is their fixation on Kennen. Kennen is an extremely important pick coming in from BuBu, and what it allows him to do is that he doesn't actually need that much jungle cover when he wants to go aggressive, because Kennen is a range champion. He actually does pretty well in lane itself, and that has actually opened up, I think, a lot more focus to move across the map. So, before in the split, clearly going topside most of the time, clearly going to mid, more of a topside focused team. But after the introduction of Kennen, I do see that BLG can actually shift a little bit more towards the bottom side, can play a little bit more towards the team fights and heralds and drakes as well. So that is a key pick to look forward to playoffs and see if the other side's going to ban that away from them.
As you alluded to earlier, when you said you're like Elite 3, the ones that you think are relevant, right? Top Esports is not in there, but even though this might shock fans, they have the same team as they did previously. In fact, they even attempted to address the weakness that everyone saw from Worlds, which is obviously Yu Yanjia, the support player. They have a player they've been subbing in there for that position. The problem is, like, this team is all over the place. Dude, this reminds me almost of like the dodgy splits from IG, where it's like you look at the names on paper and you're like, these are too good, these players. Like, they've got to be really good. And then you even see when they have a good game, this is why they also remind me of IG, when they have a good match, they still have super powerful players who can just run over anyone with any picks. The problem is, much like IG, first of all, they have some sort of weird resistance to whatever the meta is. Like, they do whatever the fuck they want with the draft. And then secondly, like, this doesn't seem like a team that has the coherent style of play. Like, I don't even know if they could answer what they really think the style of play is, dude. It almost seems like they fuck around to win the game sometimes,
I think their style, this is really weird because Top Esports, they're doing the worst compared to when they had this team together with Knight and JackieLove. This is their worst split by far. But for me, it's actually been the most entertaining split, because how well they do is solely dependent on Knight. That's basically their strategy at this point. They have an MVP split coming out from Knight, and if you look at the bans, most of them are targeted at things that have higher ceilings: Viego, Silas, and Lee Sin. So basically, if he gets these 3 picks, a lot of times what he can do is he can play like 1v2 in the side lanes. He can dance around the teams and draw them away from drakes, and then the team gets to sneak the objectives and just snowball that way. So this is a really interesting team to watch because nothing else is really working. I felt like Qingtian was kind of like TheShy light, but with even lower damage. His laning phase was okay, but a lot of times when it went into split pushing, he would just go on his own and die. So he had a very, very high death rate. And for JackieLove, it's been a kind of a meme in the LPL that if you're playing against Top Esports, you should always path bottom. Like, no matter what the matchup is, no matter what the process starts, you just always go bottom, and JackieLove will gift you a kill.
Yes.
It's really crazy how badly JackieLove has been playing. And I think, unfortunately, we can tell that everyone else on Top Esports is replaceable. They sat out Qingtian, they sat out Zuo, but for some reason they cannot sit out JackieLove. And I felt like that's just been the consistent thing throughout the entire split, is that JackieLove, he plays super greedy. A common theme is that he will overstay for waves. So a lot of times he will win the 2v2 and then stay in lane and then just get picked off by the jungler. So he gives over a bounty and then he loses wave control, and a lot of these snowballing teams just fall apart. So I really like still watching Top Esports, but for very different reasons, because it's pretty much been the Knight 1v9 show where he tries to hard carry his team, and sometimes he can still do it because the champions that are in the meta are that powerful to the point he can do it, but most of the time not.
Yeah, sadly, if you're someone again who only watches international tournaments, but then you hear like sort of like the rumours coming out from the LPL, sadly, don't worry. For a third straight year, we are all going to tell you that Knight is actually the best player in the world. It's just that if he doesn't do it at Worlds, we're just going to look like assholes again. Because it's true, dude. Like when you watch it, right? The only people I can compare him to is like prime rookie, TheShy, in terms of like he's playing in like a super skilled league. But as you say, he has games where he's just like way better than everyone in the server. It's crazy.
Yeah, he has to do it alone a lot of the times, and I'll be honest, like, if this split top esports continue to underperform, I'm not sure that Knight is going to stay on this team. I think there's a fairly high chance that Knight just goes for a different roster, and every other roster would want him, so...
Oh, of course, yeah. He'd be like an instant upgrade to like half the teams in the playoffs. That's how good the guy is, yeah. By the way, on the JackieLove point, I have a quick follow-up on that I want to ask about, because that's another thing that I've found very weird. The LPL seems to produce players that are just like, the term in English would be idiosyncratic. They just have these weird elements that only they have, but somehow they just keep doing it, dude. It's one thing, in a way, I sort of respect it. Like, I like the idea of, you know, playing to your character and who you are, but like, a player like JackieLove's an obvious example, because here's the thing, right? When he was on IG... it was always presented to me, because this is the other thing, people who love the LPL, this is why like XiaoHu just is the LPL to me. It's a player that's like, in a way it's brilliant, in a way it's really flawed though, but what you do if you're an LPL fan is you just try and like sort of argue against the part of the way it's flawed as though it was all planned, like, oh no, he actually knows that he doesn't need to gank, so that's why he comes into the team fight really strongly. It's like, that almost makes sense, except his role is fucking like ganker, basically. He's fucking jungler. Yeah. So similarly, right, for JackieLove, here's the problem I have, Clement, is when he was on IG, it was always presented to me as like, oh, in a way it's sort of genius though, because he knows that since all the attention is going to be on Rookie and TheShy and their solo lane monsters, if he plays up in lane all the time, you know, you have to pick your poison if you're the opponent. Like, which lane do you go to? All three are pushing, and you know, you can't shut down all three at once. The problem with that is, mate, as soon as he left that team, he just kept doing it anyway. Like, he still does the exact same style even when he's in a different thing. So the problem is, like, people always try to present JackieLove as like, oh, he's this shot calling AD carry and he's so smart late game. But why is his laning phase so... It's always been like this, dude. He's always been like a weird liability where he'll just like int kill. He's clearly mega skilled, but he'll just int kills that. Like, seem unforgivable for AD carry, you know. I always say AD carry's the one that has to be a bit more responsible, you know. You can't just give away kills like a mid laner might, you know.
And I'll be honest, this split is especially egregious because he's going on solo missions, and I think in previous splits you could maybe say, okay, his support wasn't up to snuff. Maybe
True.
He's,
yes,
you know, someone's trying to ward out. But this split was very obvious that he was just, you know, overstaying for wards out of nowhere. He's overstaying for lanes and stuff like that. And again, I think it's a very similar situation to TheShy. I'm not going to make too many guesses here, but it's hard to for me. It's hard to say that this guy is the same person that's playing in 2018 and trying to win worlds and trying to take down it all. It definitely does seem like sort of a motivational issue to me because these are very obvious mistakes, and I don't know what's happening. I think 369 on the other hand, though, has come back and been pretty strong. So that's a highlight point for the team. They subbed out Qingtian. 369 came in, gave the team a 20% win rate boost, and that is actually how they got into the postseason. So at least 369 I think is playing pretty steadily. To be fair, 369 still has the same issues where he's not an engager.
Of course.
And like JackieLove, he still does overstay in lane quite a bit. So it's kind of a team-wide thing in both of the side lanes. And it's I would say to fans of top esports, you know, just sit back, enjoy the Knight and Karsa 2v8 show, because neither of these side lanes are very dependable, and that is why I do not see this team as a top contender at all.
Yeah, the other thing also to add in is, like, first of all, the teams above them, like the three that you named, are very good teams. Like, those are teams that all have, like, totally coherent style, know how they want to play, strengths in the meta. So, like, realistically, there's no way top should win this split at all. But then, as I alluded to before as well, right, this is a team as well that's always had, like, its own perspective on the meta, right? They've never really just tried to play the strongest champions band. Like, that doesn't really help them at the moment.
I would say that the way they draft is that they actually just go for power picks from start to finish. Like, if you leave any of the Lee Sin, Viego, Silas stuff open, they will just take it. They'll take the Gwens, and they do not play for late game whatsoever. Their late game strategy is just overwhelming you with damage. There's no coherent, you know, front to back strategy coming out from this team. There are some side lane elements here and there, especially for Knight, because he needs to do most of the drawing away attention onto himself thing. But other than that, this is not a value drafting team. We have a couple value drafting teams like WE. We didn't really talk about them, but they're a red side 1-3-1 team. Suning, they're definitely a value drafted team. They play around 3-item carries. But for top esports, it's basically, okay, what's the strongest picks in the meta? We're just going to full on overload on them. And if we make it to the late game somewhat even, then we'll just overpower you.
Right, okay, so obviously we'll get to the big three in a second, we'll spend a lot of time on them, but the one team that is, they're out of place, but this just shows how incredible the LPL is this team Rare Atom, which inexplicably won 11 series, even though, and by the way, they're not unknowns either, like, you'd know a bunch of the players, basically whoever made this team's took a bunch of players from other squads, like, you've got people like Leanne, used to obviously replace Ning in IG, you've got iBoy, who at one point in time was supposed to be like the next Wei Zhao, which just obviously never lived up to that, like, you have good players here, so let's be real. Like, this team's not going to be a relevant playoff team. They're not going further than this. But how did they even get here, Clement? Because I'm amazed at this placing that they've pulled off.
Yeah, I think this team for me is super interesting as well because of how eclectic they are. They've actually managed to pull off a lot of different styles and been successful at each of them. They're one of the only teams that I feel like seriously went into a front-to-back teamfight setup. We saw that earlier on when they were playing things like Kog'Maw, playing things like Tristana, and it actually worked out quite well to the point where most teams actually decided to ban away their weak side top laners, mainly just the Renekton. It's kind of a global ban, but especially true for Rare Atom that you want to take those frontline tanks away. They played very, very well in that setup. And when that started to wane a little bit, they then had FoFo stepping up. He was always an assassin player by heart, even in the LMS days. And these days, his LeBlanc and Akali are just considered just like must bans. You have to ban these champions, or he will single-handedly solo carry this team to a victory. And then we had Lillian also contributing with the fact of like on a couple specific picks, especially like the Nidalee, which he has 100% win rate on, 6 games going so far. So you have, I think, a very interesting mix of team styles. They can go into early tempo games, just play very low to the ground, assassin and snowball jungle, try to play through that way. They can actually shift back into an iBoy-centric team comp, which is, I think, their weakest of their options, but it's there. iBoy is still not particularly consistent. And they also have, on the new patch, where mages are getting stronger again, they can go back to FoFo's Azir, which was his strongest champion in spring. So this is a team that I feel like has a lot of flexibility depending on the matchup. And a huge point about this team compared to their previous split, it's actually they picked up the pace quite a bit. They used to be one of the slowest tempo teams out of the entire league, but this split, I felt like Lillian is a lot more cued into what FoFo wants to do, and they're actually able to roam around the map together and get things done, set up traps, stuff like that. So we have the mid jungle improving, and to answer your question how they got here, they actually have a whole bunch of different tools that they can throw out against any given opponent and kind of switch based on who they're facing.
To me, 4-4's another player that shows which tournaments fans watch, because basically, people who are international fans, they only realistically know Flash Wolves, and maybe some of the old school ones know AHQ from the LMS. But as a result, they don't actually get that, like 4-4 and the J team that he was a part of. They were basically the stars of the LMS for the last few years, like after the Flash Wolves era, sort of. And so 4-4 coming to the LPL and actually being a bit whack when he was on that BLG team last year, that was kind of underwhelming, actually. Like, so what, like, this year's the real 4-4. Right, we're actually starting to get to see the player who was tearing up the LMS, right?
Yeah, we are. I think he's even much more improved. Like last split in spring, we actually ranked him as like probably just the best mid laner out of the entire LPL. He has a unique capability to play both ends very well. He's a great Azir, but he doesn't overdo it like Scout, where he's constantly going for the backline, and he's naturally an assassin player. So he can play in a teamfight archetype very well, and it can also play into low to ground tempo archetype, which is something that actually very few mid laners are capable of doing. You see Doinby's very clearly, he has his own style of expanding champion pools, getting priority, that sort of thing, where you have other mid laners that are much more just about, like Shanks and the Cryings, who are much more control mages, but very few that can actually play both to a very high level and still be successful. So I think, that's why we voted in the spring split for him to actually be the best mid laner in the LPL. And another thing is, like, BLG, everyone kind of knew about this, but there was a very public falling out with him and Meteor. It was all over Weibo, so the chemistry was never there. And this split around, it was very clearly stated that this was going to be his team. He didn't have to bow down to anyone else. iBoy, Hung, even though they played in the LPL more, they were saying that, oh, we can play the way we are because we have FoFo. He is the pillar of this team, and I think it just gave him a lot of confidence boosts. He played far better than I think what his LMS days would actually indicate.
The question is this, although I should obviously ask this before we talk about the big three who were the contenders for the title. The question is this, right? In the playoffs, though, does Rare Atom actually have the chance to get that fourth spot? Because obviously the LPL is going to send 4 teams this year, so they're still potentially within. Like, are they going to make it, or is it probably going to be like a top esports or someone who takes it, do you think?
Oh, so this is like the $1 million question here, and I will just say this. In the current state, I believe Rare Atom is actually better than Top Esports. I would take Rare Atom over Top Esports in a heartbeat. However, if I'm talking about total talent, though, Top Esports still heavy favorites against Rare Atom. It's just hard to see Top Esports in their current state. I think honestly, I just think it's a JackieLove issue. Like, I don't know what they're going to try to do with them, but if they don't solve it, it's not only about this year. I think Top Esports is going to lose Knight. Like, if they underperform here, I don't see why Knight stays around here and tries to 1v9 for the rest of his youth.
Indeed. Right, okay, let's do it then. Let's talk about the big three. So the first one we'll talk about is let's do the Royal Never Give Up, because if people don't know, obviously they won the spring split, but even then the context is, as I said, they did it by being the most clutch. Like, realistically, FPX was the best team there. I even thought EDG was better than them. It's just that that's the way the playoffs went. Then this split, they basically were the ultimate commercial for that famous thing people always say in every region, which is that MSI does seem to, like, give a weird debuff to teams that go there, where you come back to your home region and everyone's just worse. Well, this was the ultimate example of it, because RNG basically lost to almost every single team, and then all of a sudden it's like they just turned it on, and then they won like 8 series in a row, something mental. So they actually now all of a sudden again are back in like contention, whereas most people up until, let's be real, like I'd say like 4 or 5 weeks ago, most people actually thought they weren't going to be relevant and wouldn't even go to Worlds. So, right, how much of this actually do you think is the whole MSI thing, Clement? Like, because as I alluded to before, they already were maybe over peaking before they went to MSI.
I'll be honest. I think it's very little to do with MSI and much more to do with their base gameplay just not fitting in with the meta whatsoever. Like, I really have to give props to Tabe. I feel like he did a great job at changing the direction of RNG, and we'll go through the story again, but last time we talked about this, the main issues with RNG coming back into this was that Crying was not up to snuff in this new meta, where there were a lot of power picks like Viego and stuff like that. So the way they dealt with that is that they put him on 80 champions, bruisers like Renekton, that weren't supposed to really lose the lane. They put him on Karma, and they tried to carry through bottom lane. They also had scaling junglers. They played a lot of Diana in that sort of a setup, and they actually went back to the old RNG. They didn't play around XiaoHu as much. They tried to hold steady, wait for team fights, and that was just not a viable strategy. Crying was still getting killed in the mid lane over and over again. It's just not an AD carry centric meta at all. They wanted to play things like Kog'Maw and Tristana, and even brought out Xayah. That was actually a complete failure at the start of the split. But the way they changed it around to me was very impressive. I didn't think that they were able to make it, and they were actually 2 series away from just being mathematically eliminated from the playoffs before even the midway split. So that was how bad their situation was. And what they did change was Twisted Fate. That was a huge pickup into the team. And the importance about Twisted Fate is that they actually allowed Wei to go back into tempo champions. They didn't have to play an AP jungler. AP junglers typically come back online much later, so they aren't able to impact lanes as much. Instead, they just went with Crying. He's still not great in lane, by the way. He still has games where he just get completely blown out by the water. But at least Crying is able to roam around with the rest of the team. And another huge staple that they did also change was bot lane. Gala was never put onto hyper carries anymore. They're like, okay, this actually just does not work. He played 18 games of Varus after the midway point of split. He's basically a Varus one trick at this point. And the whole strategy for RNG is that they will use Varus, get a lane shoved up in the bottom side, and the entire team just moves top lane. They are the team that will very happily sack the entire bot lane tower to get the Herald and to get the full gold plate and first kill onto XiaoHu. And XiaoHu returned in kind with this strategy. The entire map forced their way into his side. He actually won, like, I think it was 3 best top laners back to back to back, and came out very close onto the MVP for top lanes. And I still consider him just the best top laner in the entirety of the LPL. So RNG did a massive shift from their first 3 weeks with their strategy. They still have a very exposed composition. I think they're overly reliant on 2 picks, but because they have such good synergy and because they know their tools in the Twisted Fate and the way that WE is going to connect with XiaoHu, not a lot of teams have been able to stop them, even when they know it's coming.
I'm interested in that point you make there, because when you say that you actually do consider XiaoHu the best top laner, I would have said, like, that's one of the questions I had, is, like, to me, the interesting thing about RNG is, like, as you say, how set they are on the style of play they want to play, and it's obviously such a totally unique style. As you said, they will literally have 4 players go top lane. Like, that's not a joke. Yeah. Like, the entire map will be sacked to do it. Now, the interesting thing to me is, I would have said on paper, just talk about, like, raw skill, if we were looking at, like, a character's stats, you know, I'd have Naguri as the better top laner. The difference is, like, he's just a top laner in a team where he does certain things at a top lane. Like, the difference in RNG is that the whole team is XiaoHu. Like, they give him everything, but it also seems like it's not just raw skill. Like, he seems to be super smart for that role at the moment. Like, he knows exactly what to do.
Yeah, and I think at this point in League of Legends, top laner, a lot about is just how you play around that jungle support roam that we're talking about. Right. Jungle support roam is, throughout the entire split, the defining feature between the top teams and the bottom teams. A lot of the laning phases are actually very even. Like, you rarely see big laning leads, even from the top teams these days. If you look at FPX, they're consistently losing the bot lane, so, you know, it doesn't really happen. But the real difference comes down to when your supporting cast can show up on time and how familiar with you are with the tools that they're actually bringing. And I think that's where RNG actually wins out against most teams. What they do is that they will send Twisted Fate towards the top lane for a gank, and a lot of times they catch teams off by surprise because they're going into a 3v2 situation. The enemy team might know that something's coming, but they might only have 2 people there with the jungler there, and they don't expect the mid lane to be there so fast. And what happens in the mid lane instead is that they will preemptively roam the Varus pick and Ming towards the top side of the map to kind of fill in onto the bottom side. And they don't actually care if you take away the bot lane tower. And the great thing about this strategy is that they do a lot of setup from just the ban pick phase. They will always ban away things like Ziggs, and they will always ban away things like Thresh. And the reason they do that is because Thresh is very good at preventing first kills from happening. You take a dark passage, you just take someone away from the play, and they also take away Ziggs because it has a lot of wave clear potential, even against something like the Varus. So they have a very unique setup. They run this 100% of the time almost. Like, if you give it to them, they will just run this setup. But it's been so well honed and such a well-oiled machine that teams just have not been able to crack it. We've seen time and time again, like, teams preemptively get their support there. But what RNG are doing is that they're actually progressively moving their pieces even faster than their opposition.
Okay, one of the teams I've found fascinating this whole year has to be the EDG team, because basically, if people haven't followed, they're one of the only teams that has effectively never been bad this whole year. And they're another squad where you look at the GM job, and what a fantastic job whoever put this team together is. Like, it's not a team that on paper is like the biggest names, but they're all good players, and they all, again, it's another squad that fits together. Like, I look at this team, this has got to be one of the cleanest LPL teams, right?
I actually would beg to differ. EDG, even though they are still in my top 3, they've actually had a much weaker half of the split. If you look at their crucial games, they actually had consecutive losses to playoff teams. In RNG, they lost to WE.
They lost to their rivals, yeah, exactly. Yeah.
And they lost to FPX. So their second half of the split was actually very, very shaky. So it's kind of hard for me to say that they maintain the same level the entire split, and this is very noticeable from like most of the forums and stuff like that. And we could kind of break down where EDG were the strongest, and we'll move on and talk a little bit about why they're kind of weird at the back end. So this team has 2 very defined comps. One is they run a ton of AD, they go low to the ground in all 3 lanes, and they run the Diana comp coming in for JJ. JJ actually is, I think he's proven to be one of the best junglers in the league. He has an incredibly high first blood rate, just behind RNG. And he's actually been a great teamfight carry. He can go into the backline, assassinate people. So we have been seeing this composition where you run something like Lisa and Diana, which is their most common combo. And that's been working out pretty strongly. That's one of their comps. The other one is the Aphelios with 1-3-1 composition, which is they just go on to the hyper carry train for Viper. Viper has been absolutely amazing this split. He's good in the laning phase. That's the greatest foundation of EDG, is that they will always just win out the bot lane. It doesn't even matter what you throw at them. A lot of times they will outplay 2v3s, 2v4s. So they've been absolutely amazing, and they play around his lane. They have 2 scaling side laners, and they just wait until the late game. They overpower you with the Aphelios 200 years pick and the scaling from their side. Now, the problem with their team composition is it's a pretty long-standing problem in EDG, is that their cross-map play is very, very weak. The team looks strong when they are folding into Viper on the map, but a lot of times what they get into is they ask Viper to fold into the side lanes, and that's when a lot of their issues start to come up. They're not exactly great at cross-map communication, and that has just absolutely gutted them against teams that are fast tempo and like to do overload plays. So especially against FPX and RNG, I felt like this was very obvious, where FPX and RNG will send a four-man stack into a side lane, and EDG do not respond well to this sort of a play. They will send people in 1-by-1, and a lot of times Viper will be lacking behind the play, not really in position, and they still try to take the fight anyway. So EDG for me is they have very, very obvious weakness coming into this, and their second half of the split has been honestly all over the place. So what I want to see them actually do is actually dial back on the 1-3-1 and go a little bit more towards the team fighting. We have seen Scout actually starting to play mages back again. He's revving up for the Azir play, and I think that might be a little bit easier to handle because comms are still an issue on this squad.
Like, the main issue, obviously, for EDG, as you're alluding to, is, like, they just wouldn't be favoured to win the split, right? It looks like the best teams will just pip them at the end and overtake, right?
Yeah.
Side here, fans, is this is a totally different FPX. Not only, obviously, is Nagori totally different to Gimgoo, but more importantly, let's just start with the mid lane, because this is one of those areas where you have to, like, update fans on the storyline, because everyone knows in the past you used to have to argue against international fans, like, no, just because Doinby won Worlds, he's actually not the best mid laner. Like, he's not even vaguely the best LPL mid laner. Like, he's just a really good player. Like, I always used to say he wins in, like, unorthodox ways. Like, he wins on the map instead of the lane, for example, right? This year's Doinby, like, dude, it's almost like he heard all the criticism and was like, I'm just going to take that out of the equation as well. He's actually really good individually now. What the fuck happened to this guy?
I'm not sure. It might have been something to do with Tien coming back and being in good form, but if I had to pick an MVP this split, it would definitely be Doinby.
Unironically, it's totally legit, right?
Yeah. Even though I think Knight is close, but, you know, he's had a lot less success. So Doinby is likely the MVP. And he really is the main pillar of the way this team operates. They are very close to what they did in 2019 when they actually won Worlds, and their whole strategy is revolving around mid-jungle prio. And the way they get that is Doinby has to practice an insane amount of matchups. He's played 17 different champions this split. Like, the average in the LPL is usually around 10 or 12. But if you go up to 17 and you think about the amount of matchups that are actually available, you're talking about something like 300 different matchups.
Oh, it's mental.
And
yeah,
it's absolutely crazy. But Doinby has been able to play all these different things. You cannot ban him out whatsoever. The team will purposely go onto red side. They are a red side favored draft team, and they will save the last pick for Doinby for the most part and allow him to roam around with Tien. So it's a very similar facet that they did in their championship year, but this year what they've massively improved is their teamfight capability. In 2020, the main reason that FPX was not the same team that they used to be was the fact that most of their fights, instead of being tower dives and side lane skirmishes, they now all became just big dog piles in the Drake pick. And
of course,
to be honest, the meta is still like that.
Yeah, so, of course.
Yeah, but FPX this split has been very good at actually doing Drake fights, and this is what I was most impressed about. They actually have the highest Drake percentage out of any team, and that has not been the case for prior FPX squads whatsoever. A huge part about what they're doing is that they've actually learned. I feel like this is kind of a trick from Jingdong Gaming, but they're allowing a lot of teams to actually arrive onto the Drake first. and then they're picking them off on the peripherals where they have like Gwen coming in and she's untargetable for most of the fight. You have Viego coming in from Tien, which is his best champion. He's also very hard to target. And then you have Doinby just smashing on one side with a bruiser. So they've been I think they've been the best team so far to get concaves on objectives, kill the entire enemy team, and then move towards the objective. That to me has been one of the strongest parts of FPX's improvements, and why not only have they kept all of their strengths in 2019, like the early roaming from mid and jungle, the tower diving, all that stuff, but also they're actually a really strong team fighting team at this point as well.
I'll also say as well, Clement, right? I'm up front with my biases on like other people who pretend not to have them. Like I'm like a designated LWX hater. I low-key do think he's like one of the worst players to ever win Worlds. But what I'll say is I am impressed in this team. Like they know exactly how to use him. They know what champions to use him on. They know the style, like where to put him on the map. Like there's games where he gets like the MVP in the game. Where like the team set him up for success and he knows how to play.
Yeah,
do people also think the same in the LPL? Like, obviously they're not haters like me, but they surely don't think he's like one of the best LPL ADCs.
So, I'll just use the closing sentence for FPX in the Week 10 performance, and this was posted by the LPL official website. It's LPL on FPX. Everyone else is putting on a show, but the bottom lane is getting beaten up. In Mandarin, that rhymes, so it sounds a lot more funny.
Okay,
but they're very well aware of the fact that FPX's bot lane is still not a laning powerhouse. He will stick at MVPs because they allow him to pick up a ton of kills on things like Kai'Sa.
Just an hyper carry. Yeah, exactly.
Yeah, he just gets like execution. He builds a collector and he gets a whole shit ton of kills. So the stats still look great, but do not get fooled by the stats. LWX is still very much the same guy.
Like, the one thing that's going to be cool about this, for obvious reasons, though, is if people have heard the way the narratives have been set up in this episode and how we arrived, right? If we get, because with the playoff format, there's a very good chance we can again get 2 series of FPX RNG, potentially. We could have a sick final twice, basically. Now, if this happens, just like Spring, it's going to be mega interesting, Clement, because as we set up there, we have 2 totally different stylistic teams. In fact, 2 teams who arguably are the only 2 teams in the world who play their exact style of play. So I think it's potentially a very interesting, like, sort of shadow box scenario, right? If we have them play against each other.
Oh yeah, that is very interesting to watch, and for now I do favor FPX just a little bit. I feel like RNG, the weaknesses behind their style is still there. Crying is still not getting out of laning phase against Doinby. I think even 1v1 that's not really going to happen. But on the other part, you do have RNG where you do expect them to be able to leave the bot lane first. So Ming is going to be on spot for the most part against LWX. They just hard force Varus, and honestly, FPX are not going to contest them on that one. So I think there's a very huge chance that it's going to come down to these big skirmishes in the top side, where you might have Doinby arriving before Crying, but on the other hand, Ming's probably going to show up before someone like Kris. So it's going to be very skirmish focused, and I think that's what I have personally enjoyed about this split, is that honestly League of Legends feels less like an RTS at this point, and it really does feel like just an FPS. It's just about like people arriving on the spot. A lot of times like 1 to 2 seconds difference is going to make the make or break the team fight coming upward. It's very mechanically driven. So, you know, we'll wait and see. Small favor to FPX, but it's going to come down to execution is what I'm saying.
By the way, one thing I wanted to touch on at the end, I thought as a general topic is, you know, when people have done that thing, which I do think sometimes has value, where you sort of talk about a region style. So like classically the LCK style, basically we just think of like SK Telecom, where it's like your boring slow macro with vision control, and then you just like gradually try and win from the mid gear, blah, blah, blah. Right? Well, the problem is this, right? Whenever everyone did the LPL one, I've always said, realistically, some people just unfortunately saw OMG in like season 3, and then ever since then we've never been allowed to have like like, for example, they made it sound like every single LPL team just tower dives 24/7, which is like, I don't know about that, mate. I'd maybe show you like WE, EDG, like none of these teams do any of that shit. But it's even worse now, because I actually feel like the LPL, because it's the best region, not only is there not an LPL style, like it's not just fighting all the time, by the way, it definitely isn't. Some of these teams don't do that. But more importantly, the LPL is so strong now, I feel like it really has become its own meta, dude. Like the LPL, like just take the playoff teams. You can find every style possible in League of Legends here. In fact, as we talk about with the elite teams, they can be the best team in the world and have a totally unique style. It's one thing I think is great about League at the moment.
Yeah, definitely is the case. I think what we are seeing in League is that a lot of it is coming down to very minute execution. So it's more on familiarity with your teammates, your communication, and with the toolkit that you're actually been using, rather than just some like meta tier list where it's a little bit more defined that you just take the power picks and you're fine. So I think that's been very enjoyable overall, and I do want to echo this point. I think a lot of teams should try to learn this from the LPL, is that you don't really have to be in tune with that many different styles. If you think about FPX, you think about RNG and EDG, these teams have very defined styles. They do not try to play everything in the meta. They do not even purport to say that, hey, we're going to be the best front-to-back team, or we're going to be the best Drake fighting team. They stick within their lanes, and they try to perfect that one style. They might practice a lot of different champions in order to fulfill that style given any other laning matchup, but they stick within a style for the most part. And I think that's actually what makes teams strong. And it's not really about breadth. I think it's much more about mastery at this point.
Yes, great point. And the one other thing I wanted to ask was this, right? To me, I actually think, I even thought this before MSI, to me, I actually think Korea might be in for its worst placing ever, dude, because all they had last year was the idea that if we have the best team, at least we have something there, like, at least if Damwon beats everyone else, almost like it doesn't matter that we're not the best region. Dude, I think not only are they not the best region, I don't think Damwon's going to fucking win Worlds, dude. Like, I look at the LPL now, I know I said this last year as well, but I think, like, the top 2 or 3 teams in the LPL will be the favourites for Worlds. Like, this looks like an LPL year.
Yeah, I have to say so as well. I feel like watching the LCK, not only is the pacing a lot slower, it's a lot more easier to define in terms of like just Drake fighting. I think they have less hectic compositions when it comes down to it. Though I will say, just judging by the regular season, it's kind of hard to say this. Usually what happens in the LPL is as the split goes on, because the split is so damn long and there's MSI in between, and there's NEST tournaments and all that Demacia stuff, the teams do kind of slide out at the end, but then they pick up in the postseason once more. So that's what we're waiting for. We still have 12 days before teams like FPX and EDG show up. And if you think the LPL was good before this, they're actually going to be a lot better in postseason. Like most of these teams were actually burnt out by the end of the split. And that's why, personally to me, I do feel like this at the end of Summer Split, it looked a little bit worse than earlier on. First instance at the end of spring. So we'll see, but I do expect teams to once again level up into the Worlds run.
Oh yeah, one other thing I forgot to mention, because I always try to mention this context for LPL, is one of the things that actually over the years has sometimes limited the LPL is that they often are a number of patches behind, like the Western regions, for example, and that means that the timing of when the international tournament is can have a big impact. Like, I remember years and years ago, there was like an IEM or something that happened where like the LPL at the time was like 2 patches behind, but then everyone watching this tournament didn't bother like, factoring that in their brain. They just flamed all the teams that did badly. So, right, how does that currently work at the moment? Like when World starts, is there like a catch-up period, like a couple of weeks where you have to like go to the newest patch? What's the current status right now? Do you know?
So the LPL has tried to stay within about 2 weeks. They usually patch up on a Thursday, and they change the patch coming into a weekend where you have the most important matches usually scheduled. So the most highlight matches are typically on the same patch, but they are still 1 week behind. They have cut it a lot shorter, though. We used to be much, much further behind, like 2 weeks behind and stuff like that. But now it's usually 1 week, and I think it's becoming less of a factor. And to be honest, since most of the players, they still play on Korean solo queue. Like, nobody actually trains on the Chinese master server. So I don't think it's that big of a problem. And in the LPL itself, it's actually kind of interesting because you get to see retroactive patches. Sometimes a future patch will enlighten players on how better to play.
Right, they actually find out what was OP before it gets nerfed, basically, in a way. Yeah, that makes sense. No, that's logical, yeah.
Yeah, so it's actually kind of fun to see. And I don't think it's that much of a hindrance, especially with just Korean solo queue practice being so prevalent.
This video was kindly supported by Kris with a K, Lager15, Matt Pugnatio Rajcula, Shenlong, Travis Goff, Wisetown, Zachary Carter, Zack Schmidt, Adam Ochs, Alexander Rao, Animosity, Butt Pounder 420, Kris, ErikHillestad, Hades, Jdubs, Jensen Goh, John Shelton, Joseph Ginsburg, Kovacevicd, Tobias Bernasconi, Zoomba, Zyrathenia, and a special thanks goes out to both Jerky's Minion and Joshua Gardner. Would you like to suggest a topic or a guest for my content? Maybe you want to ask one of those questions for my video AMA. Do you you want teasers, find out who the guests are for my upcoming shows. Maybe you even want to be a nerd having a long 2 or 3 hour discussion with me about anything on one of those video discussions. Well, if so, put your money where your mouth is. Join the Skrilluminati today via the Patreon link in the description box below.